Welcome to Bluegrass Brooklyn, our podcast all about the music we love, straight from the Bluegrass borough of Brooklyn, New York.
Hello and welcome to special edition number 3 of Bluegrass Brooklyn. I'm your host, Liz Wolfe. And in these special editions, we explore topics that are related to and supporting our favorite music, bluegrass. And today we speak with Matthew Sabatella. He's the founder of an organization called Ballad of America, which you can find online at balladofamerica.org. Ballad of America preserves and celebrates music from America's diverse cultural history with an extensive music library, resources for teachers, content for singers, and they even host live events. So let's have a listen. But before we go, please follow us on social media at Bluegrass Brooklyn. Brooklyn is spelled Bklyn. And of course, you can always go to our website, bluegrassbrooklyn.com. For any jams on the Upper West Side all the way through to the Bronx, you can visit bluegrassjamsnearme.com. Oh, and I also wanted to mention that the intro music we listened to was Alison Brown playing with Steve Martin on a song called Foggy Morning Breaking. Okay, so let's have a listen. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. I have invited Matthew Sabatella on for this episode. This is a little different. While Matthew is a musician, plays the guitar and sings, and the banjo, probably plays some other instruments you can tell us about. But I came to know about Matthew from an article about the history of the banjo. And I thought, wouldn't that be interesting to people who play bluegrass or are lovers of bluegrass to know more about the banjo? So that's why I invited Matthew on. So welcome, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Liz. Glad to be here.
Yeah. And so give us a little bit more of your story of who you are and what you do.
Well, I am a musician and I create live programs and recordings and videos and other resources to teach about America's music, the history of American music, and I'd like to tie it into the history of our country through music.
I would love to know a little bit more about that. And through that, I know you've established a nonprofit.
Ballad of America Incorporated. I wasn't all that interested in history at all until I discovered this body of folk music some 25 years ago, and that opened my eyes to the story of our country. So that's what I try to bring to people through my programs and writings and videos. And to that end, started a nonprofit, Ballad of America. And there's a website, balladofamerica.org, that has a free music library with a lot of articles about songs and genres. And they're always tied deeply to what was going on in our country and how the music was a part of it.
So tell me more about what sparked your interest.
Yeah, it really started when I got the Anthology of American Folk Music, which originally came out in the 1950s, a 6-record set. That was a big inspiration for the folk music revival of the 50s and 60s. People like Bob Dylan and Jerry Garcia and Joan Baez all had this collection. But the recordings were actually from the 1920s and 30s. And they were folk songs. They were songs that were commercially recorded for the record labels, but there were a lot of folk songs going back to the 1800s and 1700s. And reading the essays that came with the anthology is what really kind of brought the story of the country more into focus for me, realizing that these were, instead of, in school when you're just reading about presidents and wars, this really brought the stories of the people to life for me. So I instantly started learning to play cowboy songs and stringing them together into performances where I would introduce the songs, but it would be a whole narrative show where I'd tell stories in between the songs. And so I have a lot of different live programs on different themes, songs of westward expansion, songs of American workers. One that's called A Celebration of America's Music from Plymouth Rock to Rock and Roll. And that kind of goes from some colonial era music and kind of tells the story through spirituals and fiddle tunes into ragtime and blues and jazz into rhythm and blues and country and bluegrass into the birth of rock and roll, how it all connected to each
Mm.
other.
Is that collection of music still available?
Yes, the anthology, it is. It's not officially on any of the digital sites. It's from Smithsonian Folkways, so you can buy the CDs, and that's good to do for a variety of reasons, one of which is you get all the essays and liner notes with it. But you can get a good idea of it both from a couple of resources that are in the Ballad of America music library. I have an in-depth article about it and then a video with one of the producers of the CD reissue, Jeff Place. There's a video of me talking to him about the anthology.
So there you were reading this. Did you already play the banjo at this point?
No, I was already a guitarist and singer, but I was a singer-songwriter. It was the Beatles who got me into music, and that was, my reference point as a musician. So, no, I definitely didn't play the banjo, and I didn't play folk songs essentially, other than sort of the maybe Bob Dylan type, but not the traditional folk songs. So, yeah, I started learning songs on the guitar and singing them, performing them. I was literally on stage at a random show one day when I said, you know what, I should be playing the banjo too. So I had an older friend who helped me pick one out and taught me some of the basics. Now I play the clawhammer frailing style. I do old time banjo more so than Scruggs and bluegrass style.
Find that very funny. There I was going, hey, you know what? I should learn the banjo. And now I'm a banjo player. I wonder
Yeah.
how many banjo players listening are like, yeah, that's how it happened for me too. I think a lot of times people gain enough skills in learning guitar, etc.
It's wonderful sounding and wonderful to play and wonderful for just the arc of its story and how you can tell the whole story of the country through the instrument.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, one thing that I find interesting about it is today a lot of people think of it as a white rural mountain instrument. So that was the belief that most people had just based on stereotypes of banjo players. You got Deliverance movies like that and cartoons. I mean, it's become a lot more well known now that the banjo has roots in Africa. I'll say that, but it wasn't well known until recently. It was actually a book in 1977 by a librarian named Dina Epstein. She did research on music of enslaved people, and she made the discoveries that people in slavery were playing the banjo, were essentially the originators of it. So her book really started a wave of scholarship and interest in the African roots of the banjo. So the banjo itself didn't exist in Africa, but in West Africa, where most enslaved people came from, there were approximately 80 instruments in a family called plucked spike lutes that are essentially ancestors of the banjo. Yeah, that's the technical term.
I know
Plucked means it's plucked like a guitar as opposed to bow. Spike refers to the way the neck passes through the body or over the body, and lute is an instrument that has a neck that's distinct from the body, unlike a harp or something. So, anyway, these are the ancestors to the banjo, but it was actually in the Caribbean where it took on the form of what scholars call the early gourd banjo. So all these African lutes and early gourd banjos were made from gourds, a vegetable like a pumpkin that's native to Africa. In Africa, they had a plain round dowel stick for a neck, like a broomstick, and the strings were tied to the neck with leather or cloth. And those are the elements of these African lutes. Whereas in the Caribbean, people started adding more European inspired design elements to it. So that's where it developed the flat fingerboard and the tuning pegs, like on a violin or guitar. And yeah, mainly those characteristics. There were also changes to the way the neck entered the body. But it was with those changes that people now refer to those as early gourd banjos.
So definitely never thought of a banjo as being a Caribbean instrument for sure, although I know a lot of enslaved people were there and came through there. So
Yeah.
how did it make this transition from an African instrument to this, deliverance boy sitting there playing the banjo?
Yeah.
That's like the impression people have of the banjo. How did it make that transition?
Yeah, that's the impression people have. Well, it first started getting popular beyond African American musicians with the rise of blackface minstrelsy. And yeah, I mean, there were probably some white Americans who learned it before minstrelsy, but it was really that made it first a household kind of word and instrument here. So minstrelsy started in around 1828 with Thomas Dartmouth Rice, but the first minstrel banjo player was a guy named Joel Walker Sweeney or Joe Sweeney, and he learned to play the banjo from African American musicians in his home state of Virginia. And he painted his face black. That was the gist of minstrelsy, was people painting their faces and hands black or using burnt cork to imitate and mock Southern African Americans. It was the most popular form of entertainment. This was our biggest form of entertainment from, around the 1840s for some 50 years. And it continued on into the 1950s. There's still examples of it there. But anyway, Sweeney, as a banjo player, became really popular with his act playing the banjo in blackface. And so he toured the country. He went to England and really popularized the instrument. And from there, a lot of other minstrel performers started playing the banjo. And eventually, 1843, the Virginia Minstrels put on the first full length minstrel show featuring a full minstrel band, including banjo, fiddle, bones, and tambourine. So that kind of started really popularizing the banjo fiddle being played together. So, with the popularity of these minstrel performers, that's when we started getting manufactured banjos. William Boucher, around 1844, was the first commercial manufacturer of banjos. And that's when he stopped making them out of gourds, because gourds, they're all different. It's a complicated process. So he started making that round wooden hoop and using like drum technology to attach the head to it so it could be tightened and loosened. So other banjo manufacturers came along in the 1850s and beyond to meet the demands of both the minstrel performers and people who wanted to learn to play the banjo at home. So that became a whole industry. We started to see in the 1850s and beyond these banjo instructional manuals. So through the second half of the 1800s, people are buying banjos and buying instructional books and learning to play songs from them. And that's when we also started to see more changes in the physical instruments. As the decade went on, instrument makers started making more intricately designed instruments with fancy inlays, and they added frets to the instrument and started marketing them really to people to buy for home use in the Victorian parlors of American homes. They were marketed a lot to women. They made like ladies' models of banjos that were a little smaller, and so many improvements in the instrument and changes that make it, including some that added resonators in the late 1800s, making them a lot more like the banjos of today. So over those years, the banjo became the most popular fretted instrument in the United States. The repertoires in the books was also changing. It moved away from minstrel songs to some like European classical music and waltzes and mazurkas. And also, that's where we started to see the African lutes and the early gourd banjos. People usually played in a clawhammer or frailing type style, downstroke, which is the way old time players play today, frailing or clawhammer. But in these books, we started to see a transition to what they called guitar style, which was the up-picking style
Mm.
that eventually led to people like Earl Scruggs turning it into a bluegrass instrument. So a lot of changes over the 1800s. And then it became really popular on record when people started making phonographs and Victrolas in the 1890s. Ragtime music was the craze, and people think of ragtime as piano music, but there were actually more ragtime banjo recordings made than piano recordings. Fred Van Epps and Wes Osman were huge stars of the kind of classical and ragtime banjo world in those years.
Yeah. Well, the banjo is certainly a very versatile instrument. I have friends who play it in all different styles, many different ways. And again, I think it does do the banjo a disservice to have that rednecky deliverance. All you have to do is go on YouTube and watch a few old Beverly Hillbillies or any of those types of shows. And, it's always made fun of. And I think that it does do a disservice to the instrument itself and people's impression of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that image started coming along maybe, I don't know, I want to say the 1920s is when we started recording old time music, like the rural mountain music. And they were calling it either old time music because a lot of the music was from the 1800s, or hillbilly music is the label that stuck with it. So that's the impression. Hillbilly, they eventually renamed country music. But, the record labels wanted to play up the ruralness of it. So people dressed the part in their overalls. But fortunately, since Dina Epstein's book, Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, I mentioned the wave of scholarship marked the beginning of what Rhiannon Giddens called the Black Banjo Renaissance. And so, in addition to the books, a lot of Black musicians are taking up the banjo again. People like Rhiannon Giddens, she had her group Carolina Chocolate Drops, made up of several other African American musicians, and who all, in the wake of the band breaking up, Dom Flemons, Justin Robinson, Hubby Jenkins, all went their separate ways and continue to play the banjo and talk about the roots of the banjo. Other people like Jake Blunt is in that category. There's Dr. Dina Jennings, who makes banjos and teaches people how to make them and play them. And then there's a Black Banjo Reclamation Project that tries to reverse these stereotypes and get more African Americans connected with this part of their legacy and heritage.
It's interesting that you said so much of the marketing of a banjo was directed in those Victorian times to women. And it's a very typical bluegrass phenomenon where you'll see very few women at jams in general and playing music. So it's interesting how so many women played the banjo and then somehow it became in the same way that it was an African American instrument and then it became this white instrument. Now we went from women to men again. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or insight around that.
Not on the women issue, but yeah, you're right. It's, definitely less associated. But there's also the question of why, as it became more associated with white musicians in the 1920s, why did Black people play it less? Why did they stop playing it as much? And a lot of people have theorized that it's because of the legacy of minstrelsy, that they didn't want the negative associations with it, but that hasn't been proven to be the case. There's a book called Hidden in the Mix: The African American Presence in Country Music. And it talks about, various aspects of how African Americans have influenced and been part of country music. But There's a particular article by a historian named Tony Thomas who basically tackles that question of why Black people played it less in these years. And he concluded that it was the fact that in the 1920s, they were playing guitar in blues music. Blues was kind of more of a guitar music. The guitar suited it better with its ability to bend notes and more sustain and more bottom end. Also, jazz, which used a four-string plectrum banjo or tenor banjo. Up until the 1920s, the guitar started to take over for that in jazz because, for one, the instrument itself became improvements in the guitar that made it louder and able to be heard in these circumstances without amplification. And the more blues developed and we got electric guitars, the conclusion is just that African Americans essentially deserted the banjo because they were developing new music that required new instruments: blues, jazz, swing, gospel, rhythm and blues, rock and roll. It just, was more suited to guitars and electric guitars. And that's, why they became less associated with it.
So tell me more about Ballad of America in terms of your future vision for what it could do for the music of America.
Well, one thing is we're trying to develop more resources for teachers to use in classrooms in ways that would have made a world of difference to me growing up when I was taking history classes and not relating to anything. So, ways to integrate songs into the studies. So, when you're learning about the American Revolution or learning about slavery or the Civil War, you're not just reading about it, you're hearing the thoughts and the sounds and the music of the people who are going through this, which I think will result in people being more interested in learning about it and potentially being more engaged eventually in the civic process and just having a better understanding of where we came from. A big emphasis of what we do is trying to highlight the way different cultures have played a part in our music. All the influence of African Americans, there's so much from different parts that have been part of different kinds of music. German Americans, and it just goes on and on. The English, Scots Irish, and so many people from different parts whose music combined in certain ways here, which I think can give more understanding and empathy for other people not like them as well.
I'd always think back to my elementary school education. We had a lot of music. We had a band and we had a chorus. And, Miss Carney had this music program that somehow she subscribed to, that every week or month or something, we would get a new 45 record, which she would be like a new song that was out, and she would play it for us. And I guess we would analyze it. I don't know.
Are they actual new songs of the
Yeah,
day,
like
like hits of the
literally,
day?
yeah, like Helen Reddy, like,
Okay.
you know that song Angie Baby?
I don't know. That's Helen Reddy. I don't
Yeah,
know. I
it's
know
no, don't think of the not Angie from the
not
Rolling
the
Stones.
Rolling
No,
Stones.
it's a story of a girl, like a teenager who is a little bit crazy, and she plays every night. She gets into sort of this dream state and stuff, and then one day a boy creeps up to her window and she traps him in there or something. It's a very weird song. It's like a modern version of a
Yeah,
bluegrass song, essentially. But anyway, this is what she was teaching us. I'm just pointing out, like, when I think back to
interesting.
what the music was. And I actually have very fond memories of Miss Carney. I think she really was probably a very good musician, and she was a great singer, and we had this music and stuff. Maybe it could have benefited me a little bit more to learn a little bit more about other things, like the things that you're teaching on Ballad of America. Maybe she just didn't have the resources.
Feel like people were learning the songs maybe a little before that time. Like I do a lot of performances in over 55 communities for people significantly older than that usually. And they always know a lot of the old folk songs in ways that, we used to do that in school and camp. I think some music teachers are doing it, but definitely not as much as they were once upon a time. So, yeah, we have resources for that too. We have some lead sheets like sheet music online and some karaoke type recordings. So, we're constantly trying to build up what we have there just to keep this music in circulation and let people get a better understanding of it.
Well, I do remember learning the Erie Canal.
Mm,
That's a song that
okay.
we had
Yeah.
some book, and I still know all the words to that.
A lot of these songs are in the books because they're so old, they're public domain. So, just for practical reasons, I think companies would put the public domain songs in there so they don't have to pay royalties.
Well, thank you so much for this very interesting conversation. I know there's an hour-long history of the banjo video that people can watch, as well as an article that they can scroll through, and so many other resources on your website. And I would encourage people to go to that balladofamerica.org. If people have more questions, or if they're a teacher or something and they want to learn more, is there a way on your website for them to contact you?
Yeah, my email address is on there. It's Matthew at balladofamerica.org, but you can find it on the website also.
Great. And I
Yep.
would encourage our listeners to spread the word if you know some teachers and you know some people that are interested. It's just been great to get that additional perspective and feel like I'm just more connected. And but if anybody's thinking about learning the banjo, you might want to pick it up. Thank you again so much for this wonderful interview. Again, I encourage everybody to reach out to Matthew or use his resources that he's worked so hard to create for the betterment of all. And I really appreciate having you on.
I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm really glad I got to speak with Matthew to learn not only about his organization and the good work that they're doing, but also to hear more about the history of the banjo. And we will be publishing our usual full-length episode later this week, and we do hope that you will tune in then. So remember to follow us at Bluegrass Brooklyn. Brooklyn is spelled BKLYN on Instagram and in Facebook. You can visit bluegrassbrooklyn.com. And of course, check out bluegrassjamsnearme.com for information about jams in New York City. So to take us out, we're going to listen to Ralph's Banjo Special, featuring Kristen Scott Benson, Gina Britt, and Allison Brown, three amazing women banjo players. This song is produced by Allison Brown on her record label Compass Records, and of course, it won Instrumental Recording of the Year in 2025. Thanks for listening. We look forward to seeing you around the jam circle.